The coffee maker's final gurgle echoed through the empty break room as I pressed my badge against the card reader for the third time in 12 seconds. 6:47 a.m., early enough that the executive floor still smelled like industrial cleaner instead of expensive cologne, early enough that I could review the quarterly compliance reports without anyone asking why a night shift data analyst needed access to executive meeting minutes. My fingers had memorized every coffee ring stain on this break room table over the past 18 months. The same 18 months I'd been documenting every policy revision, every budget reallocation, every seemingly innocent email that crossed my desk after midnight when the executives thought no one was watching. "You're here early." I didn't startle. Marcus Webb's footsteps had been approaching down the marble hallway for 30 seconds. His Italian leather soles had a distinctive squeak on the third tile from the elevator. I'd learned to recognize everyone's walking patterns during my shift. Survival skill. "Good morning, Mr. Webb." I closed the compliance folder and slid it beneath my employee handbook. "Just getting some coffee before the morning rush." He moved to the espresso machine, the executive's only Breville, that cost more than I made in a month. His Hermes tie was already perfectly knotted at 6:48 a.m. Everything about Marcus Webb was perfectly controlled, from his salt and pepper beard, trimmed to exactly 3 millimeters, to the way he never used contractions when he spoke. I did not realize night shift employees had morning access to this floor. The words hung in the recycled air, not a question. An observation that felt like a scalpel finding exactly the right pressure point. "My badge works until 7. I said, which was true. What I didn't mention was that I'd been reviewing the badge access logs for 6 months and knew exactly whose badge worked, when, where, and why. "I can head downstairs if you prefer." "That will not be necessary." He pressed a button on the espresso machine. The grinding sound filled the silence. "You are Elena Vasquez, correct, from the night audit team?" He knew exactly who I was. Marcus Webb had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer 8 months ago, and one of his first initiatives was operational streamlining, corporate speak, for identifying which employees could be eliminated without impacting quarterly numbers. Every night shift worker in the building knew our names were on his list. What he didn't know was that I held an MBA in organizational psychology and a law degree from a state school that I'd never mentioned during my interview. When you're a 34-year-old Latina woman who needs health insurance for your diabetic mother, you take the job that says yes, not the job that fits your qualifications. That's right. "How long have you been with Meridian Financial?" 18 months. The coffee maker gurgled again. I stood to refill my cup, which gave me a reason to move closer to the espresso machine. Close enough to smell his cologne, something expensive with bergamot. Close enough to see the small scar above his left eyebrow that he usually covered with concealer. 18 months, he repeated like he was filing the number away. "You have been reviewing compliance reports, I see." My hand didn't shake as I poured coffee. "Just the public sections, making sure our night audit procedures align with the new federal requirements." This was partially true. I had been reviewing compliance reports, but I'd also been cross-referencing them with budget allocation staff meeting minutes and email metadata that technically fell within my data access permissions. 18 months of watching patterns emerge. 18 months of building a picture that no single person was supposed to see. Admirable initiative. He collected his espresso, a perfect shot with golden crema. "Though I wonder if your time might be better spent on your assigned responsibilities." "Of course, Mr. Webb." He moved toward the elevator, then paused. "Elena, I hope you understand that Meridian Financial is committed to efficiency. We value employees who understand their role in our organization." The elevator doors closed with a whisper. I sat back down at the break room table and opened the compliance folder. My hands were steady now. Inside the folder were 47 printed emails, 12 budget reports, and one audio file on a flash drive that I'd encrypted with a password only I knew. Marcus Webb thought he was sending a message about knowing my place. What he didn't know was that I'd been keeping perfect records of his. At 7:15, I took the service elevator down to the basement level where the night audit team worked. Our office was tucked between the server room and the building maintenance shop in a space that used to be storage until Meridian Financial expanded and needed somewhere to put the employees who processed data while the executives slept. "Morning, Elena." James looked up from his dual monitors. He was 26, fresh out of college with a computer science degree, working nights to pay off student loans. "How was your coffee break with the COO?" "Informative." I logged into my workstation and opened the audit queue. 47 transactions to review before 7 a.m., all routine expense reports and budget transfers. Did you finish the server backup logs? Yeah, but there's something weird in the access reports from last week. Someone was pulling executive email archives at 3 a.m. Tuesday, way above normal data usage. I kept my expression neutral. Probably IT doing system maintenance. Maybe. James highlighted a line on his screen. But the access wasn't logged under any IT credentials. Just says authorized personnel. That was me, of course. Tuesday nights were when I compiled my weekly reports cross-referencing email patterns with budget changes, looking for the connections that only became visible when you had access to both operational data and executive communications. The kind of analysis that required someone with an MBA and a law degree, not the high school diploma listed on my employment file. I'll mention it to the day shift supervisor, I said. Thanks. Oh, and Elena. There's a company meeting tomorrow. All hands 9 a.m. in the main conference room. My coffee suddenly tasted like copper. All hands meetings at Meridian Financial happen twice a year, once for quarterly results, once for organizational restructuring. It was March, too early for quarterly results. Did they say what it's about? Efficiency improvements. James lowered his voice. Rosa in HR said they're announcing the night shift optimization plan. I spent the rest of my shift reviewing transaction logs and thinking about efficiency. Marcus Webb's version of efficiency. Over the past 8 months, night shift had lost 12 employees to redundancy and restructuring. Each elimination was perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and perfectly timed to avoid any pattern that might trigger discrimination complaints. What Marcus Webb didn't know was that I'd been tracking those patterns for 18 months. At 6:30 a.m., I printed my final report and locked it in my desk drawer. Then I walked to the parking garage, sat in my Honda Civic, and pulled out my phone. Mom, it's me. I switched to Spanish. How are your glucose levels this morning? Good, mija. The new medication is helping. Her voice was tired but warm. Are you eating enough? You sound stressed. I'm fine, just work stuff. I watched early morning commuters filing into the building through my rearview mirror. Mom, do you remember what you told me when I started law school about fighting battles you can win? Of course. Why? I think I'm about to find out if I learned that lesson. At 8:55 a.m., I walked into the main conference room wearing my best blazer and carrying a manila folder. The room was already full. Day shift, night shift management, and support staff all crowded around tables that had been arranged in a U-shape with the executive team at the head. Marcus Webb stood at a podium perfectly groomed and precisely on time. Behind him was a PowerPoint presentation titled Meridian Financial Operational Excellence Initiative. Good morning, he said. His voice carried easily through the room's built-in sound system. Thank you all for being here. As you know, Meridian Financial has experienced significant growth over the past 2 years. This growth presents opportunities, but it also presents challenges. I found a seat in the back row next to Carmen from the custodial staff and David from building maintenance. The chairs were arranged so everyone faced the executive team. Theater design. Today I want to share our plan for operational excellence, a comprehensive approach to ensuring Meridian Financial remains competitive in an evolving marketplace. The first slide appeared streamlining operations for maximum efficiency. My folder contained 47 pages of documents. I'd arranged them in chronological order with post-it notes marking the most relevant sections. At the top of the stack was a printed email from Marcus Webb to the HR director dated 6 weeks ago with the subject line, Night Shift Optimization Phase 2 Implementation. Efficiency requires difficult decisions. Marcus Webb continued. Over the next 60 days, we will be implementing a new operational structure that reduces redundancy while maintaining our commitment to excellence. The second slide, staff optimization, eliminating duplicate functions. Carmen shifted in her seat beside me. She'd been with Meridian Financial for 15 years, ever since her husband died, and she needed health insurance for her 3 kids. David had worked building maintenance for 12 years and knew every pipe wire and ventilation duct in the building. Neither of them appeared on the third slide, retained positions, essential personnel. I know change can be challenging. Marcus Webb said, his voice warm with practiced empathy. But I want to assure everyone that these decisions are based solely on operational requirements. Meridian Financial is committed to treating all employees fairly and in accordance with applicable laws. The fourth slide appeared severance packages and transition support. I opened my folder and removed the top document. It was a printed email thread between Marcus Webb and the HR director discussing the legal parameters for eliminating night shift positions without triggering discrimination complaints. The thread included specific discussions about age, ethnicity, and English language proficiency as factors in determining which employees to retain. Marcus Webb was still talking about fairness and legal compliance when I stood up. Mr. Webb, I have a question. The room went quiet. All eyes turned toward the back row, where a night shift data analyst was interrupting the COO's presentation. Of course, he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Please. You mentioned that these decisions are based solely on operational requirements. That is correct. I walked toward the front of the room carrying my folder. I'm curious about the operational requirements that led to the specific selection criteria outlined in your email to HR dated February 14th. His smile faltered. I'm not sure what email you're referring to. The one where you wrote, and I quote, "Priority should be given to retaining employees who can adapt to day shift requirements and communicate effectively with clients." I opened my folder and read from the printed email. Consider language barriers and cultural fit when making final determinations. The room's temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Carmen gasped softly beside me. James from night shift was staring at Marcus Webb with his mouth slightly open. That email discusses general staffing considerations. Marcus Webb said carefully, all employment decisions at Meridian Financial comply with applicable laws. I'm sure they do. I moved closer to the podium. That's why I was curious about the operational requirements that led to the retention of all 12 day shift employees over the age of 50 while eliminating 9 of the 11 night shift employees in the same age category. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Do you have a specific question, Ms. Vasquez? Actually, yes. I pulled out the second document in my folder, a spreadsheet I'd compiled showing employee retention rates by age, ethnicity, and shift assignment over the past 8 months. Could you explain the operational requirements that resulted in a 93% retention rate for day shift employees with English as their first language compared to a 31% retention rate for night shift employees who speak English as a second language? One already was sure. The silence in the room was complete, except for the coffee maker's distant gurgle from the break room. Marcus Webb's voice remained perfectly controlled. Ms. Vasquez, I think this discussion would be more appropriate in a private meeting. Perhaps we could, I also have questions about the operational requirements that led to the budget reallocation patterns documented in your weekly reports to the board of directors. I opened to the third section of my folder, specifically the correlation between night shift elimination schedules and quarterly bonus targets for executive staff. His face had gone pale beneath his perfect tan. That's enough. Is it? I looked around the room. 47 employees staring back at me, many of them realizing for the first time that their job eliminations weren't random cost-cutting measures. Because I have 18 months of documentation here, and I'm not sure we've covered all the operational requirements yet. Marcus Webb stepped away from the podium. Security. Before you call security, I said, pulling out my phone, you should know that copies of all this documentation have been sent to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Department of Labor, and a very patient employment attorney who's been waiting for exactly this kind of comprehensive evidence. The room erupted. Voices from every direction, questions, exclamations, someone crying, someone else demanding to see the documents. Marcus Webb was speaking rapidly into his phone, probably calling HR or legal. There's one more thing, I said loud enough to cut through the noise. The room quieted again. Mr. Webb, do you remember our conversation in the break room yesterday morning? His eyes narrowed. What conversation? I held up my phone. The one where you told me that efficiency requires difficult decisions and that you hoped I understood my role in this organization. I don't recall saying that. That's interesting because I recorded it. I pressed play on my phone's audio app. His voice filled the room through my phone's speaker. Elena, I hope you understand that Meridian Financial is committed to efficiency. We value employees who understand their role in our organization. Then my voice, of course, Mr. Webb. Then his voice again lower and more menacing. Good, because some roles are more permanent than others. I'd edited out the middle portion of our conversation, but the implication was clear. In context with everything else I'd presented, it sounded like a direct threat tied to the discrimination pattern. Marcus Webb's face had gone from pale to red. That recording is taken out of context. It's been manipulated. Has it? I turned to address the room. I've been documenting every policy change, every budget reallocation, every staff meeting, and every informal conversation for 18 months. I have 47 printed emails, 12 budget reports, and audio recordings of 6 different conversations with management staff. I walked back to the podium and set my folder down on the presentation table. Mr. Webb is right about one thing: efficiency does require difficult decisions. So here's mine. Every employee in this room who's been targeted for elimination has the right to see the documentation that led to that decision. Every employee has the right to understand whether those decisions were based on legitimate operational requirements or on discriminatory criteria that violate federal employment law. I opened my folder and began distributing copies of the most damaging emails. And every employee has the right to know that Meridian Financial's Board of Directors will be receiving a comprehensive report detailing these patterns at their emergency meeting this afternoon. Marcus Webb had stopped trying to regain control of the room. He was typing rapidly on his phone, probably alerting the legal department to prepare for crisis management. Carmen from custodial staff was reading over my shoulder, her eyes wide. This email: they were going to eliminate my position because I lack advanced communication skills for client interaction. You clean offices at night, David from maintenance said, reading another document. What client interaction? Exactly. I pointed to a highlighted section in Marcus Webb's email thread. But notice how the same operational requirement doesn't apply today. Shift custodial staff even though they work the same job with the same client interaction level. James from Night Audit was reading the spreadsheet I'd compiled. Elena, according to this data, they were planning to eliminate the entire night shift except for 2 positions. Which 2 positions? Carmen asked. I pointed to the retention list. Building security and emergency maintenance. The 2 positions that require someone to be in the building all night for legal and safety compliance. So they were going to eliminate everyone who wasn't absolutely required by law, David said slowly. Not quite. I flipped to another page in the documentation. They were going to eliminate everyone who wasn't absolutely required by law and who fit certain demographic profiles. Notice that the 2 retained positions went to the youngest employees with the highest English proficiency scores. Marcus Webb had finished his phone call and was walking toward the exit. This meeting is over. All employees should return to their regular duties while we review these allegations through proper channels. Mr. Webb, my voice stopped him at the door. Before you go, could you clarify one thing for the record? He turned back, his jaw clenched. What? In your email to HR dated March 1st, you wrote that the night shift elimination plan needed to be implemented before the annual compliance audit. Could you explain the operational requirement that created that timeline? He Horn. His silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. I'd been counting. Because according to the audit schedule I found in the board meeting minutes, the annual compliance audit isn't scheduled until September. 6 months away. Another silence, longer this time. Unless, I continued, you were concerned that the annual compliance audit might identify the discriminatory patterns in your staffing decisions, and you wanted to complete the eliminations before that review took place. Marcus Webb's face had gone rigid. You're making serious accusations without understanding the complexity of our operational requirements. You're right. I don't understand all the operational requirements. I pulled out the final document in my folder, a legal analysis I'd prepared the night before. That's why I've scheduled a meeting with the EEOC for tomorrow morning to review these patterns with employment discrimination specialists. This is extortion. No, Mr. Webb, this is documentation. The room was completely silent now. 47 employees watching their COO realized that his perfectly legal, perfectly documented discrimination plan had been perfectly documented by someone else. I'll be in HR for the rest of the morning if anyone wants to review the complete documentation file, I said to the room. Copies are available for anyone whose position has been affected by the Operational Excellence Initiative. I gathered my folder and walked toward the door. As I passed Marcus Webb, I stopped. By the way, the operational requirement that led me to compile this documentation, I needed health insurance for my diabetic mother. Turns out that when your job depends on staying invisible, you become very good at watching everything. I left him standing in the conference room, surrounded by 47 employees who were no longer willing to accept his version of efficiency. 3 hours later, I was sitting in HR Director Patricia Coleman's office, watching her review the complete documentation file. Patricia was 52, had been with Meridian Financial for 8 years, and had signed off on every single elimination decision in Marcus Webb's operational excellence plan. These emails, she said, flipping through the printed pages. Where did you obtain these? They were sent to distribution lists that include night audit staff for compliance review purposes. I have legitimate access to all executive communications related to operational policies that affect my department. This was technically true. What I didn't mention was that I'd figured out how to cross-reference email metadata with budget allocation reports to identify patterns that weren't visible to someone reviewing either dataset in isolation. Elena, I need you to understand that Meridian Financial takes discrimination allegations very seriously. We have policies and procedures. 18. I've read your policies and procedures, I interrupted. I've also documented how those policies were circumvented to achieve discriminatory outcomes while maintaining legal deniability. She set down the papers and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd entered her office. What do you want? I want Meridian Financial to make this right. What does that look like to you? I'd spent 18 months thinking about this question. First, all employee eliminations under the Operational Excellence Plan are suspended pending an independent review of selection criteria. Second, employees who were terminated under the plan are offered reinstatement with full back pay. Third, Marcus Webb's authority over staffing decisions is transferred to an oversight committee that includes employee representatives. Patricia was quiet for almost a minute reviewing her notes. That's a significant request. It's a reasonable response to 18 months of systematic discrimination. These are serious allegations, Elena. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. I leaned forward. Patricia, I have an MBA in organizational psychology and a law degree. I've been analyzing workplace discrimination patterns for 8 years. I know exactly what I'm looking at. Her pen stopped moving. You have an MBA and a law degree from State University. I graduated summa cum laude from both programs. Then why are you working night audit? Because I'm a 34-year-old Latina woman who needed health insurance for my mother, and this was the job that said yes. I smiled without humor. Also because someone with my qualifications working night audit is invisible to executives who make assumptions about their employees' education levels. Patricia was staring at me like she was seeing a completely different person. Elena, if you have those qualifications, why didn't you apply for a policy analyst position or compliance management? We've had openings. Have you looked at your hiring data for policy analyst positions over the past 2 years? She frowned. What do you mean? I opened my folder to a section I hadn't shared in the morning meeting. Meridian Financial has filled 17 policy analyst positions in the past 24 months. 15 went to candidates with MBA degrees from private universities. 13 went to white men under 35. 2 went to women, both white, both with family connections to board members. That doesn't necessarily indicate. 0 went to candidates with Spanish surnames. 0 went to candidates over 40. 0 went to internal candidates who didn't have management recommendations from executive staff. I closed the folder. Patricia, I couldn't get an interview for a position I was overqualified for because the informal hiring criteria excluded candidates like me before the formal review process even began. She was quiet again, processing this information. You want to know why I stayed in night audit for 18 months collecting documentation instead of looking for a better job? Because I realized that Meridian Financial's discrimination problem was bigger than just my career prospects. And I realized that someone with my background and access could build a case that might actually change the system instead of just escaping it. Elena, she said slowly, if what you're alleging is accurate, this could result in federal investigation, litigation, massive financial liability. Or, I said, it could result in Meridian Financial becoming a model for how companies can proactively address systemic bias and create genuinely inclusive workplaces. She looked at me for a long moment. You really think that's possible? I think Marcus Webb made these decisions because he believed no one was watching and no one would challenge him. I think you signed off on them because you trusted that his analysis was accurate and legally sound. I think the board approved them because they were presented as routine efficiency measures. I leaned back in my chair. But now everyone is watching. The employees know what happened. The EEOC is reviewing the documentation. The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss liability exposure. Marcus Webb's approach isn't sustainable anymore. But what do you propose instead? Transparent criteria for all employment decisions. Diverse hiring committees for all positions above entry level. regular bias training for management staff, independent review of all mass layoffs or reorganizations, employee representation on policy committees. Patricia was taking notes now. Those are significant structural changes. They're the changes that would have prevented this situation in the first place. And if the company implements these changes, you would withdraw your EEO complaint. I would convert it from a discrimination complaint to a request for compliance monitoring. The EEOC offers programs to help companies implement voluntary corrective measures without admitting wrongdoing. It's better for everyone. She set down her pen. I need to discuss this with the board. Can you give me 24 hours? Of course. But Patricia, I stood to leave. The employees who were scheduled for termination next week still don't know if they'll have jobs on Monday. Whatever the board decides, they deserve to know their status before the weekend. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's apartment to check her blood sugar and help her organize her medications for the week. She lived in a small one-bedroom in a senior housing complex surrounded by photographs of family and potted plants that she tended with the same careful attention she'd given to raising 4 children as a single mother. Mija, she said, testing her glucose levels. You look tired. Are you eating enough? I'm fine, Mom. Just had an interesting day at work. She gave me the look that mother's perfect after 34 years of practice, the one that says she knows exactly when her children are understating their problems. Nah, what kind of interesting... I sat down at her kitchen table and told her about the morning meeting, the documentation file, and the conversation with HR. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. So you think they will make the changes you asked for? She said when I finished. I don't know. It depends on whether they think it's cheaper to fight the discrimination complaint or implement the structural changes. And if they decide to fight, I smiled at her. Then I'll remind them that I've been documenting everything for 18 months and I'm very good at building cases. She reached across the table and took my hand. Elena, when you started law school, I was worried you were choosing a career that would make you hard. Too focused on winning, not focused enough on helping. And now I see that you learned the right lesson. Sometimes the best way to help people is to build a case so strong that doing the right thing becomes the obvious choice. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the documentation file one more time. 18 months of emails, budget reports, meeting minutes, and audio recordings. Hundreds of hours of analysis, cross-referencing, and legal research. All building toward one question. Was it possible to change a discriminatory system from the inside? At 9 p.m. my phone rang. Patricia Coleman. Elena, the board met this afternoon. They've asked me to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow morning to discuss your proposals. All board members, H2 Executive Committee, that includes Marcus Webb. I was quiet for a moment thinking. Patricia, I appreciate the board's willingness to meet, but I think there might be a conflict of interest in having Marcus Webb participate in discussions about his own discriminatory practices. The board feels that all stakeholders should be represented. I understand. In that case, I'll be bringing representation as well. Weki, what do you mean, I'll be accompanied by the employment attorney who's been reviewing this case and by representatives of the affected employees. Another silence. Elena, this doesn't have to become adversarial. You're right, it doesn't. But it also doesn't have to remain a conversation between management and a single night shift employee. If the board wants to discuss systematic changes to company policies, then the discussion should include the people those policies affect. How many representatives? Sharina wants. 1 from each affected department, so 5 people, total 3 employees, 1 attorney and me. That's a significant group for a board meeting. Patricia, Meridian Financial eliminated 47 positions under the Operational Excellence Plan. 5 representatives seems reasonable. She was quiet for almost a minute. I'll need to check with the board about expanding the meeting. Of course, let me know what they decide. After she hung up, I called the employment attorney who'd been reviewing my documentation. Sarah Chen had 20 years of experience with workplace discrimination cases and had been waiting for exactly this kind of comprehensive evidence package. Elena, this is good news, she said after I explained the board meeting invitation. It means they're taking the allegations seriously, or it means they want to find out how much I know before deciding how to respond. Either way, it's an opportunity. Do you have employee representatives in mind? Carmen from Custodial, David from Maintenance, and James from Night Audit. They represent different departments and different types of discrimination patterns. Good choices. What about your goals for the meeting? I'd been thinking about this question since Patricia's call. I want the board to understand that this isn't about punishing Marcus Webb or extracting financial settlements. It's about changing the systems that allowed this discrimination to happen in the first place. And if they're not interested in systematic change, then we proceed with the EEOC complaint and prepare for litigation. But Sarah, I think they might be interested. Discrimination lawsuits are expensive and unpredictable. Voluntary compliance is cheaper and gives them control over the timeline. Unless Marcus Webb convinces them that your documentation is flawed or legally insufficient. I smiled. That's why I've been keeping perfect records for 18 months. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian Financial 45 minutes early and used my badge access to review the executive conference room setup. The board had arranged the room with a long table, board members on one side, our group on the other. Traditional adversarial positioning. I moved the chairs into a circle. At 9 a.m., the executive committee filed in. Board Chair Dorothy Hamilton, Marcus Webb CFO Robert Chen, and HR Director Patricia Coleman. They paused when they saw the rearranged seating. I thought a circle might facilitate more productive discussion, I said. Dorothy Hamilton was 72 years old, had served on nonprofit boards for 30 years, and had been elected board chair specifically because of her experience with organizational restructuring. She looked at the circle arrangement and nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Please, everyone, sit wherever you're comfortable. Our group had arrived together, Carmen David James, Sarah Chen, the attorney, and me. We'd spent an hour the night before reviewing the documentation and discussing goals for the meeting. Before we begin, Dorothy said, I want to acknowledge that these are serious allegations that require careful consideration. Our goal today is to understand the facts and determine appropriate next steps. Marcus Webb shifted in his chair. He was perfectly groomed as always, but I noticed the small muscle tension around his eyes that indicated stress. I also want to note, Dorothy continued, that Elena's documentation has been reviewed by our legal department. The patterns she's identified raise significant concerns about our employment practices. Marcus Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Elena, Dorothy said, would you please summarize your findings for the board? I'd prepared for this moment for 18 months. The operational excellence plan resulted in the elimination of 47 positions over 8 months. These eliminations followed clear demographic patterns that correlate with age, ethnicity, primary language, and shift assignment. I opened my folder to the statistical analysis I'd prepared. Employees over 50 were eliminated at a rate of 74% compared to 12% for employees under 30. Spanish-speaking employees were eliminated at a rate of 68% compared to 9% for native English speakers. Night shift employees were eliminated at a rate of 81% compared to 15% for day shift. Those numbers could reflect legitimate operational requirements, Marcus Webb said. They could, I agreed. That's why I cross-referenced them with job performance reviews, client feedback scores, and productivity metrics. I flipped to the next page. The correlation between elimination decisions and performance metrics was statistically insignificant. The correlation between elimination decisions and demographic factors was statistically significant at the 99% confidence level. Robert Chen, the CFO, was reviewing his own copy of my analysis. Elena, where did you obtain the performance data for this comparison? Annual review summaries are part of the compliance documentation that night audit staff review for federal reporting requirements. I have access to aggregate performance data for all employees, but not individual performance reviews. Correct. However, I was able to analyze patterns in performance ratings by department and shift assignment. The data shows no significant performance differential that would justify the elimination patterns under the operational excellence plan. Dorothy Hamilton was taking notes. What specific changes are you recommending? First, suspension of all planned terminations pending independent review. Second, reinstatement of terminated employees with back pay. Third, implementation of transparent hiring and promotion criteria. Fourth, diverse selection committees for all employment decisions. Fifth, regular bias training for management staff. Sixth, employee representation on policy committees. Marcus Webb leaned forward. Those recommendations would fundamentally alter our management structure and operational flexibility. They would fundamentally alter our ability to make discriminatory employment decisions, Carmen said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Carmen had been silent for the first part of the meeting, but now she was holding a printed copy of Marcus Webb's email about her lack of advanced communication skills. Mr. Webb, she said, I've been cleaning offices for 15 years. I have 3 children, all college graduates. I speak 3 languages and manage a household budget better than most financial analysts. When you decided I lacked any communication skills, what exactly were you measuring? Marcus Webb's face flushed. Employment decisions are based on multiple factors, like the factor where you wrote that custodial staff should be younger and more adaptable to client interaction requirements. David interrupted, reading from another email. I maintain the HVAC systems that keep this building operational. What client interaction requirements apply to checking air filters and replacing heating elements? James from Night Audit held up his copy of the retention analysis. According to this data, you plan to eliminate my position and transfer my responsibilities to day shift staff with less experience and lower performance ratings. The only operational difference is that I'm 38 years old and speak Spanish at home with my family. The room was quiet except for the coffee maker's distant gurgle. Dorothy Hamilton set down her pen. Marcus, how do you respond to these specific examples? Marcus Webb was silent for almost 30 seconds. The Operational Excellence Plan was designed to streamline operations and reduce costs. Individual decisions were based on comprehensive analysis of operational requirements. What comprehensive analysis, I asked? Because I reviewed all the documentation associated with the elimination decisions, and I found no evidence of job analysis skills assessment or productivity measurement beyond the demographic factors outlined in your emails. Those emails were preliminary discussions about general staffing considerations. Were they? I pulled out my phone. Because I have a recorded conversation where you told me that some employee roles are more permanent than others in the context of discussing my understanding of my role in the organization. I played the edited audio clip again. His voice filled the conference room. Some roles are more permanent than others. That recording is taken out of context, he said quickly. Is it because in context with your documented elimination patterns and your emails about demographic factors in staffing decisions, it sounds like you were telling me that employees who fit certain profiles should accept that their positions are inherently temporary. Dorothy Hamilton was looking at Marcus Webb with an expression I couldn't quite read. Marcus, these are very serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support your position that these decisions were based on legitimate operational requirements? He was quiet for another long moment. The analysis was conducted verbally with department heads. We didn't generate written reports for routine operational decisions. Routine operational decisions that eliminated 47 positions and created potential federal liability exposure. Robert Chen asked. Marcus, that's not consistent with our standard procedures for major organizational changes. The timeline required expedited implementation. What timeline? I interrupted. According to the board meeting minutes, there was no deadline or external requirement driving the Operational Excellence Plan. The only timeline reference I found was your email about completing eliminations before the annual compliance audit. Another silence, longer this time. Sarah Chen, the employment attorney, spoke for the first time. From a legal perspective, the documentation Elena has compiled presents a strong case for systematic discrimination. The statistical patterns combined with the written communications about demographic factors would likely result in federal investigation and significant liability exposure. She looked around the circle. However, the EEOC also offers voluntary compliance programs that allow companies to address discriminatory practices proactively. If Meridian Financial implements meaningful structural changes and provides appropriate remediation for affected employees, this situation could become a model for proactive bias prevention rather than a costly legal battle. Dorothy Hamilton nodded. What would meaningful structural changes look like? Sarah opened her briefcase and removed a document she'd prepared. Transparent job criteria for all positions. Diverse hiring committees including employee representatives. Regular bias training for management staff with accountability measures. Independent review of all mass layoffs or reorganizations. Employee grievance procedures with external mediation options. Annual equity audits with public reporting. Those changes would require board approval and significant resource allocation, Robert Chen said. The alternative is federal investigation, litigation costs, settlement payments, and potential punitive damages, Sarah replied, plus ongoing regulatory oversight and damaged reputation. The structural changes Elena is proposing would cost less than 6 months of legal fees. Marcus Webb had been increasingly quiet during this exchange. Now he stood up abruptly. This is extortion. You're using threats of legal action to extract organizational changes that go far beyond addressing any legitimate compliance issues. The room went completely silent. Marcus Dorothy Hamilton said carefully, "Please sit down." "No, I will not sit here and listen to a disgruntled employee and her attorney threaten the company with fabricated discrimination claims." Fabricated, Carmen stood up too. "Are you saying these emails are fake, that the statistical analysis is wrong, that the recorded conversation didn't happen?" "I'm saying that employment decisions are complex, and taking isolated examples out of context doesn't constitute evidence of systematic discrimination." David held up his copy of Marcus Webb's email about custodial staffing. "What context makes it appropriate to write that custodial positions should be eliminated based on age and cultural fit considerations?" That email discusses staffing optimization based on discriminatory criteria, James interrupted. "There's no context that makes age-based employment decisions legal when they're not related to legitimate job requirements." Marcus Webb's face had gone red. "You people don't understand the complexity of running a business. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made." "You people," Carmen repeated. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Everyone was staring at Marcus Webb, who had just revealed more about his thinking than any amount of documentation could demonstrate. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I said quietly. "That's exactly what you meant. And that's exactly why the Operational Excellence Plan targeted the employees it targeted." Dorothy Hamilton's voice was ice cold. "Marcus, I think you should leave this meeting." "Dorothy, you can't seriously be considering—" "I'm seriously considering removing you from all authority over personnel decisions effective immediately." She looked around the circle. "Robert, please prepare documentation transferring Marcus's staffing responsibilities to the executive committee pending board review." Marcus Webb stared at her for a long moment, then walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back to me. "This isn't over, Elena." "Yes, I said it is." After he left, the room was quiet for several minutes. Dorothy Hamilton was reviewing her notes, Robert Chen was typing on his laptop, and Patricia Coleman looked like she was processing everything she just witnessed. "Elena," Dorothy finally said, "on behalf of the board, I want to apologize for what you and your colleagues have experienced. The patterns you've documented are unacceptable and inconsistent with Meridian Financial's values." "Thank you. I also want to discuss implementation of the structural changes you proposed." "Robert, what would be the timeline and resource requirements?" Robert Chen looked up from his laptop. "The policy changes could be implemented within 60 days. The bias training program would require external consultants. I estimate 90 days for full implementation. Employee committee representation would need bylaw amendments, so probably 120 days. What about remediation for terminated employees?" "Reinstatement offers with back pay could be extended within 2 weeks. We need legal review to ensure compliance with unemployment benefit regulations and tax implications." Sarah Chen nodded approvingly. "That timeline seems reasonable. We'd also recommend an independent audit of current employment practices to identify any additional bias patterns that might not be captured in Elena's analysis." "Agreed," Dorothy said. "Patricia, please work with Sarah to design the audit scope and identify qualified external consultants." "Of course." Dorothy looked around the circle. "Are there any other concerns or requirements we should address?" Carmen raised her hand tentatively. "What happens to Mr. Webb?" "Marcus will remain with the company in a non-management role while the board determines appropriate disciplinary action. He will not have authority over employment decisions." "And if he retaliates against any of us?" David asked. "Any retaliation attempts will result in immediate termination," Dorothy said firmly. "You have my personal commitment on that." James looked at me. "Elena, what happens to your position? Are you staying in night audit?" I smiled. "Actually, I'm hoping to apply for the policy analyst position that's been posted for 6 months. With your qualifications, you'd be overqualified for that position," Robert Chen said. "Have you considered the director of compliance role we've been trying to fill? I'd be interested in discussing it." Dorothy Hamilton was taking more notes. "Robert, let's schedule Elena for interviews with the compliance committee next week. And let's also discuss creating a new position, director of equity and inclusion, to oversee the structural changes we're implementing." "That's an excellent idea," Patricia said. "Elena, would you be interested in that role?" I looked around the circle at Carmen, David, James, Sarah, and the board members. 18 months ago, I'd been invisible in this building, a night shift data analyst whose education and skills were completely overlooked. Now I was being offered the opportunity to help design and oversee systemic changes that could prevent discrimination for future employees. I'd be very interested. Good, let's schedule those interviews as well. The meeting ended with handshakes, business cards exchanged, and a timeline for implementation. As we packed up our materials, Carmen approached me. Elena, I want to thank you for everything you did. When I got that elimination notice, I thought my 15 years here didn't matter to anyone. They mattered to me, I said. They mattered to everyone in this room. David nodded. I was ready to just accept the termination and look for another maintenance job. I never thought anyone would challenge these decisions. I almost didn't, I admitted. For months, I just documented everything without knowing if I'd ever use it. It wasn't until I saw how many people were affected that I realized staying silent would be worse than speaking up. James laughed. Elena, you've been planning this for 18 months. That's not staying silent, that's building the perfect case. As we left the conference room, I noticed that Marcus Webb's office was already being cleaned out by security staff. His personal items were in boxes, and his computer access had been revoked. I felt a moment of something that might have been pity. Marcus Webb was probably a decent person who'd gotten caught up in corporate efficiency pressure and unconscious bias. But decent people who make discriminatory decisions still cause real harm to real employees. Sometimes the best way to help someone become better is to hold them accountable for their actions. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the Director of Equity and Inclusion office that Robert Chen had created for me on the executive floor. My new office had windows, a door that closed, and a budget for implementing the structural changes we discussed in the board meeting. My first official act was to send reinstatement offers to all 47 employees who'd been terminated under the Operational Excellence Plan. 43 accepted immediately. 3 had found other jobs but requested letters of recommendation. 1 declined but asked for assistance with his new employer's reference check. My second official act was to design transparent job criteria for all positions at Meridian Financial. The policy required specific skills assessments, diverse interview committees, and written justification for all employment decisions. My third official act was to implement bias training for all management staff, including scenario-based exercises and accountability measures tied to performance reviews. My mother came to visit my new office during my first week in the position. She walked around the space examining the diplomas I'd finally hung on the wall and the family photographs I'd placed on my desk. Mija, she said, this is a beautiful office. It's a good job, Mom, and the health insurance covers your diabetes medication. She smiled. That's not why I'm proud of you. I know. You could have used all that documentation to sue the company and win a big settlement. Instead, you used it to change the system so other people won't face the same discrimination. I looked out my office window at the parking garage where I'd sat in my Honda Civic 18 months ago, wondering if I was brave enough to challenge Marcus Webb's Operational Excellence Plan. Mom, do you remember what you told me when I started law school about fighting battles you can win? Of course. I think I finally learned that lesson. Sometimes the battle you can win isn't the one that gets you the biggest individual victory. Sometimes it's the one that changes things for everyone who comes after you. She hugged me across the desk. Elena, that's exactly the lesson I hoped you would learn. That afternoon, I was reviewing applications for the expanded compliance team when Patricia Coleman knocked on my office door. Elena, do you have a few minutes? Of course, please sit. She settled into one of the chairs I'd arranged in front of my desk, the same circular arrangement I'd used for the board meeting. I wanted to update you on Marcus Webb's situation. How is he adjusting? He's been transferred to a senior analyst position in the financial reporting department. No management responsibilities, no authority over employment decisions. He's struggling with the adjustment. I can imagine. He asked to meet with you. I was quiet for a moment considering this. What does he want to discuss? He says he wants to apologize. And you think I should meet with him? Patricia was quiet for almost a minute. Elena, I've worked in HR for 12 years. I've seen a lot of workplace conflicts, discrimination complaints, and disciplinary actions. Most of the time, the person who caused the problem either denies responsibility or blames external factors. And Marcus Webb, Marcus Webb spent 3 days reviewing all the documentation you compiled. He's realizing that his efficiency decisions caused real harm to real people, and that his assumptions about employee capabilities were based on unconscious bias rather than objective analysis. I looked out my office window thinking, Patricia, I appreciate that he's having this realization, but I'm not sure what purpose a meeting would serve. Maybe none, but maybe it would help both of you move forward. What do you? What do you think, sir? She smiled. I think you'll make the right decision whatever you decide. That evening, I called Sarah Chen to discuss Marcus Webb's request. Elena, you have no obligation to meet with him, she said immediately. The legal issues are resolved, the structural changes are being implemented, and you have a new position. You don't owe him anything. I know, but I keep thinking about something my mother said, that the goal isn't to punish people for making mistakes. It's to help them learn to make better choices. That's a generous perspective. Maybe, or maybe it's practical. Marcus Webb is going to be working at Meridian Financial for the foreseeable future. If he's learned something from this experience that benefits everyone, if he's just looking for an opportunity to justify his actions or blame me for the consequences, then the meeting accomplishes nothing. How would you structure it to ensure a productive outcome? I thought about this question for several minutes. I'd want Patricia to facilitate the meeting. I'd want a clear agenda focused on his acknowledgement of the harm caused and his commitment to supporting the new equity policies. And I'd want the meeting to be brief, 30 minutes maximum. Those sound like reasonable parameters. The next morning, I called Patricia and accepted the meeting request with my conditions. She scheduled it for the following week in a conference room on the neutral ground of the third floor. Marcus Webb looked different when he walked into the conference room. His usually perfect appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie was crooked, his hair was less precisely styled, and he had the exhausted look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. Elena, he said, thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course. Patricia had arranged 3 chairs in a triangle with herself positioned to facilitate the conversation. Marcus, you requested this meeting to discuss your perspective on recent events. Would you like to begin? He was quiet for almost 30 seconds, gathering his thoughts. Elena, I want to apologize for the way I treated you and for the decisions I made regarding night shift employees. I appreciate that. I also want you to know that I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing all the documentation you compiled, and I'm realizing how my actions affected people in ways I never considered. He looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. When I wrote those emails about operational requirements and employee characteristics, I thought I was making rational business decisions. I didn't think about the fact that communication skills and cultural fit were code words for discriminatory assumptions. What do you think now? I think I caused real harm to people who deserve better treatment. I think I made decisions based on unconscious bias rather than objective analysis. And I think you were right to document everything and challenge the system. Patricia was taking notes. Marcus, what have you learned from this experience? I've learned that good intentions don't excuse discriminatory outcomes. I've learned that efficiency measures can perpetuate systemic bias if they're not carefully designed. And I've learned that people like Elena, who have the skills and knowledge to identify these patterns, are exactly the people whose perspectives I should have been seeking out rather than dismissing. He turned back to me. Elena, I know that my apology doesn't undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that I support the structural changes you've implemented, and I'm committed to being part of the solution going forward. I studied his face, trying to assess whether his words reflected genuine understanding or strategic positioning. His exhaustion seemed real. His remorse seemed real. But I'd learned over the past 18 months to be skeptical of surface presentations. Marcus, I appreciate your apology and your acknowledgement of the harm caused. I have one question for you. What's that nanny you? In your new position, you'll be working with diverse colleagues and reviewing financial data that includes employment metrics and demographic patterns. If you notice concerning patterns in the future patterns that might indicate discrimination or bias in other departments, what will you do? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I'll report them to you through the equity and inclusion reporting structure, and I'll make sure I understand the difference between legitimate operational requirements and discriminatory assumptions. Good. Patricia looked at both of us. Is there anything else you need to discuss? Marcus Webb shook his head. Elena, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope that over time I can demonstrate that I've learned from this experience. Marcus, I said the best way to demonstrate that you've learned is to help create a workplace where discrimination doesn't happen in the first place. If you're committed to that goal, then we're working toward the same thing. We shook hands and he left the conference room. Patricia and I stayed to debrief. How do you think that went? She asked. I think he's genuinely remorseful and genuinely committed to change. Whether that translates to sustained behavioral change over time remains to be seen. And if it doesn't, then the structural changes we've implemented will catch it before it causes the kind of systematic harm that happened with the Operational Excellence Plan. 6 months later, I was presenting Meridian Financial's first annual equity audit to the board of directors. The report showed significant improvement in hiring diversity retention rates across demographic groups and employee satisfaction scores related to fairness and inclusion. The bias training program has been completed by all management staff, I reported. Anonymous feedback indicates high engagement and increased awareness of unconscious bias patterns. We've also implemented diverse hiring committees for all positions above entry level with measurable improvement in candidate diversity. Dorothy Hamilton was reviewing the statistical summary. These are impressive results, Elena. What challenges have you encountered? The biggest challenge has been changing informal systems and cultural patterns that aren't captured in official policies. We're addressing this through ongoing education mentorship programs and regular assessment of workplace culture indicators. Robert Chen raised his hand. What about cost-benefit analysis? Have the structural changes impacted operational efficiency? I smiled. Actually, the opposite. Our employee retention rates have improved significantly, which reduces recruiting and training costs. Our diverse hiring committees have identified high-quality candidates who might have been overlooked under the previous system, and our improved workplace culture has resulted in higher productivity metrics across all departments. So the business case for equity is strong, very strong. It turns out that when you eliminate discriminatory barriers and create inclusive systems, you get better business outcomes as well as better social outcomes. After the board meeting, I stopped by the night audit department to check on the team. James had been promoted to night shift supervisor, and he'd hired 3 new analysts to handle the expanded workload as Meridian Financial continued to grow. Elena, he said when I walked into the basement office, how was the board presentation? Good. They approved the budget expansion for next year's equity initiatives. Any word on the new policy analyst positions? 5 positions approved with priority for internal candidates. Applications are due next week. Carmen is definitely applying. Her youngest daughter just graduated college, so she's ready for a career change. I looked around the office where I'd spent 18 months documenting discrimination patterns and building a case for systematic change. The space looked different now, brighter, more organized with updated equipment and better lighting. But more importantly, it felt different. The employees working here knew that their skills and contributions were valued, that advancement opportunities were available, and that discriminatory treatment would be identified and addressed. James, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't challenged Marcus Webb's plan? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. You mean if you just accepted your termination notice and looked for another job? Yeah. Elena, 47 people would have lost their jobs. The discriminatory patterns would have continued with the next round of efficiency measures, and Marcus Webb would still be making personnel decisions based on unconscious bias rather than objective criteria. But I almost didn't speak up. For months, I just documented everything without knowing if I'd ever use it. But you did use it, and you used it at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way to create exactly the right outcome. I smiled. You think it was the right outcome? Elena, look around. Carmen got promoted to a day shift supervisory position. David is now the head of facilities management. I'm running the night audit team. You're the director of equity and inclusion. And Marcus Webb learned that efficiency measures based on discriminatory assumptions aren't actually efficient. And the company learned that preventing discrimination is cheaper and more effective than defending against discrimination complaints. Everyone wins. That night, I drove to my mother's apartment to help her with her weekly medication organization. She was testing her blood sugar when I arrived, and her levels were well within the normal range. The new insurance coverage is working well, she said. My endocrinologist says my diabetes management is excellent. I'm glad, Mom. She looked at me with that expression, mother's perfect after 34 years of practice, the one that says she knows when her children have something important to discuss. What's on your mind, Mia? I sat down at her kitchen table and told her about the equity audit results, the board meeting, and my conversation with James about alternative outcomes. So you're wondering if you made the right choice. she asked when I finished. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd just taken a settlement payment and moved to a different company. I could have avoided all the stress and conflict, and they left the discriminatory system in place for the next person. Right. She was quiet for several minutes organizing her pills for the coming week. Elena, when you were in law school, you used to complain that legal education focused too much on winning arguments and not enough on solving problems. I remember. What did you learn about solving problems? Duristermin. I thought about her question. That sustainable solutions require changing systems, not just addressing individual cases. And what did you do at Meridian Financial? I changed the system. She smiled. Elena, you could have won an individual case and collected a settlement payment. Instead, you built a comprehensive solution that addresses the root causes of discrimination and prevents future harm to other employees. But it was harder, it took longer, it required more risk, and it created more lasting change. She reached across the table and took my hand. Mia, the choice you made wasn't the easiest choice or the most immediately rewarding choice, but it was the choice that helped the most people and created the most positive change. You think it was worth it? I think you already know the answer to that question. 1 year later, Meridian Financial was recognized by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as a model employer for proactive bias prevention. The award ceremony was held at the company's headquarters with representatives from other corporations coming to learn about our structural changes and implementation strategies. I was standing in the main conference room, the same room where Marcus Webb had announced the Operational Excellence Plan, preparing to present our program to the visiting executives. The room had been rearranged with round tables instead of the adversarial U-shape, and the walls were decorated with employee recognition photos that reflected the company's increased diversity. Carmen approached me before the presentation began. She was wearing a business suit and carrying a portfolio. She'd been promoted to operations manager and was completing her MBA through the company's continuing education program. Elena, I wanted to thank you one more time for everything you did. Carmen, you don't need to thank me. We all worked together to create these changes. But you took the biggest risk. You challenged the system when the rest of us were too scared or too tired to speak up. David joined our conversation. He was wearing a facilities management supervisor uniform and looked confident and relaxed. Elena, my oldest son, just started college. He's majoring in business administration, and he wants to focus on workplace equity and inclusion. He says you're his career inspiration. That's incredibly flattering. It's accurate. You showed all of us that one person with good documentation and strategic thinking can change an entire organization. James approached our group carrying a tablet with the latest audit results. He'd been promoted to Director of Operations Analytics and was working on expanding the equity monitoring system to other companies in the industry. Elena, the quarterly numbers look great. Retention rates are at an all-time high, hiring diversity continues to improve, and employee satisfaction scores are consistently above industry benchmarks. What about cost impacts? So the structural changes have been cost neutral over the past year, and we're projecting cost savings going forward due to reduced turnover and improved productivity. I looked around the conference room at my colleagues, people who 18 months ago had been facing elimination under a discriminatory efficiency plan and who were now thriving in leadership positions within an inclusive organization. You know what the most important outcome has been, I said. What's that? Carmen asked. Marcus Webb approached me last week to discuss expanding the equity program to our subsidiary companies. He's volunteered to help with the implementation planning. Really? Really? Turns out that when you give people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and contribute to positive change, most of them will take it. The presentation began, and I walked to the front of the room to address the visiting executives. Behind me was a PowerPoint slide titled, From Discrimination to Inclusion, a Comprehensive Approach to Workplace Equity. Good morning, I said. 18 months ago, Meridian Financial was facing potential federal investigation for systematic employment discrimination. Today, we're here to share how we transformed that crisis into an opportunity for meaningful organizational change. I clicked to the first slide, The Power of Documentation and Strategic Action. Change begins with someone willing to pay attention, keep records, and speak truth to power. But sustainable change requires systematic solutions that address root causes rather than just individual symptoms. As I talked about policy changes, training programs, and accountability measures, I thought about my mother's advice about fighting battles you can win. The battle I'd chosen to fight wasn't about personal vindication or financial compensation. It was about creating a workplace where discrimination couldn't flourish in darkness, where employees like Carmen and David and James could advance based on their capabilities rather than demographic characteristics, and where executives like Marcus Webb could learn to make better decisions because systems existed to catch and correct bias before it caused harm. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, the same sound that had marked the beginning of this journey 18 months ago. But everything else had changed. The employees were different, the policies were different, and the culture was different. Most importantly, the future was different. Not just for me, but for everyone who would work at Meridian Financial in the years to come. After the presentation, I returned to my office and found an email from Sarah Chen, the employment attorney who had helped me navigate the legal complexities of challenging systematic discrimination. Elena, her email read, "I've been contacted by 12 other companies who want to implement similar equity programs. Would you be interested in developing a consulting practice to help organizations proactively address bias and discrimination?" I looked out my office window at the parking garage where I'd sat in my Honda Civic so many months ago, wondering if I was brave enough to challenge an unjust system. Now I was being invited to help other organizations avoid creating unjust systems in the first place. I started typing my response. "Sarah, I'd be very interested in expanding this work. Let's schedule a meeting to discuss the possibilities." Before sending the email, I added one more line. "The most effective way to fight discrimination is to build systems that prevent it from happening. I think we can help a lot of organizations learn that lesson." I pressed send and leaned back in my chair. Through my office walls, I could hear the familiar sounds of Meridian Financial's daily operations, phone calls, conversations, the printer running, people moving through the hallways going about their work. But underneath those familiar sounds, I could hear something else. The quiet confidence of people who knew their contributions were valued, their opportunities were equal, and their workplace was committed to fairness and inclusion. It was the sound of a system that worked the way it was supposed to work. It was the sound of justice.